There are worlds invisible to the eye, where threads of destiny intertwine with the breath of eternity, and every moment conceals an echo of an unknown path. The soul, an eternal wanderer in the labyrinths of existence, often forgets its true origin, lost in the reflections of illusory light. But there are moments when the veil thins, allowing one to see what was hidden and to hear a call that penetrates through time. Let me tell you how this story began, overturning the very concept of life itself. From the very first glimmers of consciousness, even before reason matured and began to form its initial conclusions, he was incessantly indoctrinated with the belief that the true meaning of existence resided beyond the confines of his inner universe, concealed within the labyrinths of the external world. Society, with its unspoken rules and pervasive dogmas, like a skilled sculptor, molded from the pliable clay of his worldview, an ideal where career heights, public acclaim, thunderous applause from the crowd, and a relentless pursuit of material abundance were presented as the only worthy goals. He was taught that within these external attributes lay the coveted key to genuine happiness, to a profound satisfaction capable of filling any internal void. He, like a diligent student, followed these prescriptions meticulously, with pedantic precision, treading along well-worn paths, as if blindly believing in the infallibility of the chosen route. Every step he took, every decision he made, was dictated by this immutable conviction. He methodically built his life, brick by brick, according to this external script. Achievements followed one after another, bringing fleeting triumph, but each new victory, like a mirage in the desert, only momentarily quenched his thirst. Each time a new goal was reached, when the applause subsided and the celebratory hustle gave way to everyday life, a strange, almost tangible silence descended. This silence, at first barely noticeable, gradually grew deeper and more poignant, taking on the character of an intrusive melody that simply refused to cease. It permeated the most hidden corners of his consciousness, filling the space between victories, between moments of external triumph, with a feeling of inexplicable emptiness. This was not merely the absence of sound, but something far more profound, the absence of an internal response, the lack of resonance with what, it seemed, should have brought absolute happiness. He tried to drown it out with new goals, new projects, even grander and more ambitious ones, hoping that the next level of success would finally bring the sought-after satisfaction. However, this silence, like a loyal companion, followed him everywhere, becoming increasingly unbearable, increasingly insistent. It did not shout, did not demand, but its silent presence was louder than any scream. Its silent existence was more palpable than the loudest sound. In this oppressive silence, devoid of familiar external landmarks and the noise of achievements, his inner voice, long suppressed by the external clamor, began to break through. It was then, in one of those moments, when external successes brought no joy, but only intensified the feeling of deep inner dissatisfaction, when familiar supports began to crack, a question, like a spark in absolute darkness, ignited in his consciousness. It was quiet, almost inaudible, but its energy was capable of overturning the entire universe. This question was not rhetorical. It was sincere, piercing, and demanded an immediate answer, although he himself did not yet comprehend its full depth. It sounded so simple and yet so all-encompassing. Is this all? This was not just a question. It was the cry of his soul, desperately seeking something more than the illusions of external well-being offered to it. This was the first, barely perceptible, but inevitable step towards awakening, towards realizing that the true meaning of life, perhaps, was not at all where he was taught to look. After the seed of doubt was sown in his consciousness, he began to notice with startling clarity a certain elusive emptiness that, like the finest mist, permeated through all layers of his outwardly seemingly prosperous life. It was not tangible, had no form, yet its presence was distinctly felt, and most disturbingly, it could not be filled by new successes, loud praises, or even the most desired acquisitions. This emptiness did not manifest itself in the midst of daily hustle, when his attention was absorbed by an endless stream of tasks and external interactions, but arrived with the onset of night's silence, when the world stood still, and external noises ceased. It was in these silent hours, when the external scenery vanished and no one could see his impeccable masks, that it gained particular strength, becoming almost palpable. It crept up silently, like a shadow, and enveloped his consciousness, making him feel strangely alienated from himself. This sensation was akin to phantom pain, arising where a limb had long been amputated, something that was once part of a whole, but now lost, and its absence generated a deep, inexplicable restlessness. This was not just a fleeting feeling of discomfort, but a persistent, profound sensation, as if some forgotten, rejected part of his being, his soul, was persistently knocking from within, trying to break through layers of long-standing delusions and imposed beliefs. This knock was not loud, but its monotony and unwavering persistence were far more powerful than any scream, for it emanated from the very core of his being. He tried to rationalize this feeling, to find a logical explanation for it in his daily worries, in fatigue or stress, but each time he realized that the source of the restlessness lay much deeper. It was not related to external circumstances, to failures or setbacks, of which, incidentally, there were few in his life. On the contrary, the more he succeeded in the external world, the stronger this internal sense of incompleteness became, the louder this silent call resonated. Gradually, the realization dawned that the problem was not in himself as a person, not in his abilities or aspirations, but in the fundamental foundation upon which his entire worldview was built. The issue was not his imperfection, but what he had been taught to believe since childhood, in those false premises that had firmly taken root in his subconscious, like weeds stifling the shoots of true knowledge. He was indoctrinated to believe that happiness and meaning were external to him, in constant achievement and consumption, in the approval of others, in the pursuit of elusive ideals. He was programmed for the external, and now, when this program malfunctioned, the terrible truth was revealed. He had built his house on sand, ignoring what was truly important. This understanding, like a cold wind, permeated him completely, yet at the same time, it brought a certain liberation, the first glimmer of hope that the path to healing begins with a reevaluation of fundamental truths. As the illusions of external well-being began to dissipate, revealing an increasingly palpable emptiness, he realized with terrifying clarity that the true chaos, capable of shattering even the most robust external structures, did not lurk in the world around him. It did not stem from unpredictable turns of fate, from human injustice, or from catastrophes shaking the earth. No, it was hidden deep within, in the most secluded corners of his own being, like an ancient, slumbering beast awaiting its hour. This was not merely a dark side of character, not individual flaws or mistakes, but something far grander and all-encompassing, an abyss. An abyss that he, sometimes unconsciously, and sometimes quite deliberately, had so painstakingly avoided, turning away from its gloomy depths, as if hoping it would disappear on its own if simply ignored. For years, he had built walls around himself out of achievements, out of the approval of others, out of constant busyness, just to avoid confronting this inner world full of shadows and unresolved conflicts. He erected barriers of logic and rationality, trying to convince himself that everything could be explained and controlled, and that which defied explanation simply did not exist. However, this abyss, like a living organism, did not just fail to disappear from his ignoring it. It grew with each time he turned away, when he preferred flight to confrontation, when he chose the superficial instead of the profound. Every suppressed feeling, every unlived fear, every rejected emotion, like a drop of water falling into a bottomless well, only deepened it, making it darker and vaster. It slowly but surely expanded, like an invisible crack penetrating the very foundations of his worldview. His inner world, which he had so long strived to control and refine solely from the outside, now appeared before him in its true, frightening nakedness. There, in this abyss, awaited his own, authentic truth, the truth about his fears, about his unbearable pain, about his insecurity, about all those parts of himself that he had so diligently hidden, not only from others, but also from himself. This was a truth that was incredibly terrifying to touch, for he intuitively felt that this touch would change everything, destroy the familiar order, and bring to light what he had so long and carefully concealed. The fear of this contact was all-encompassing, permeating to the very bones, for it promised not just discomfort, but complete annihilation, the death of the former self. It was there, in these depths, that not only his personal demons awaited, but also collective shadows, archetypal fears passed down from generation to generation. He understood that attempts to escape were futile, that the walls he had built merely postponed the inevitable. This inner abyss, this personal hell, was not a punishing force, but rather a mirror reflecting everything he refused to see in himself. Now, as the external masks began to crumble and familiar paths brought no relief, there was no choice left. The only way to find peace was to plunge into this darkness, to come face to face with all his banished parts, for only then could he find the path to true light and wholeness. This was an invitation to the deepest, most frightening, but also the most necessary journey within himself. For many years, in what had become an almost unconscious habit, he diligently perfected the art of concealment, masterfully creating the illusion of flawlessness, even when his inner world was on the verge of complete collapse. The smile he presented to others was a mask honed to perfection, designed to hide the unbearable pain that gnawed at him from within when all his supports began to crumble. He had built an invisible, yet impregnable fortress around himself from a false self, an ideal version of himself, meticulously constructed for one sole purpose: to be unconditionally accepted by others, to earn their approval, to avoid judgment and rejection. Every gesture, every word, every action was part of this carefully orchestrated performance where he played the role of a person who had everything under control, a successful, strong, unyielding person. This ideal version, created by him for the outside world, was so convincing that at times he himself began to believe in its authenticity, losing sight of his true face. He learned to expertly mimic happiness, confidence, and calmness, even when a hurricane of fears, doubts, and despair raged within. However, wearing this mask, no matter how skillfully crafted, required colossal internal effort. It was not just a part of his image, but a heavy, uncomfortable armor that became increasingly unbearable with each passing day, weighing down his soul with its immense burden. Beneath this feigned well-being, the pain he had so diligently hidden not only did not subside, but grew louder, more insistent, like a furious knocking on a closed door, demanding to be finally opened. The soul, which had long meekly submitted to the dictates of the false ego, no longer wished to remain silent. Its voice, at first barely discernible, transformed into a piercing scream, its echo reverberating in every cell of his body. It was tired of pretense, of constant tension, of the need to conform to others' expectations, of a life where he was merely an actor on the stage of someone else's drama and not the author of his own script. The mask, once a protection, had now become a prison, depriving him of air, freedom, and authenticity. He felt himself suffocating under its weight, losing connection with who he truly was if all these layers of superficial perfection were peeled away. This internal conflict between who he appeared to be and who he truly was reached its climax. Every morning, looking at his reflection, he saw not himself, but only an artfully created illusion that now evoked rejection. The soul demanded true freedom, freedom from the bonds of pretense, from the need to pretend to be happy when inside everything was torn apart by longing. It desired to return to its primordial state, to that purity and spontaneity that had been lost under the oppression of social norms and the fear of being rejected. The time had come to remove this mask, to realize its falsehood, and to accept what lay beneath it, no matter how painful and frightening this discovery might seem. The path to his authentic self lay through this painful but necessary unmasking. The inevitable moment arrived when the carefully constructed armor of his false self, which had so long and flawlessly protected him from confronting painful reality, could no longer withstand the escalating internal pressure. This once sturdy and seemingly indestructible shield, built over years from external approval and perceived achievements, suddenly fractured deeply and unbearably. This was not a sudden, devastating blow from the outside, but rather the result of a long subterranean process of internal workings, a slow but relentless disintegration from within. The pain he had so long and diligently suppressed, stifling it in the deepest recesses of his consciousness, burst forth with unprecedented force, like a powerful current breaking through a dam. This breakthrough was devastating. It did not merely cause discomfort. It began to mercilessly dismantle the entire accustomed order of his existence. What seemed unshakable yesterday, today crumbled to dust, exposing the fragility and illusory nature of his former world. His meticulously planned life, his ideal image, his controlled serenity, all of it was under threat of complete annihilation. This moment was not a sign of weakness, as an outside observer might think, or as he himself was accustomed to judging such emotional manifestations. On the contrary, it was the beginning of the end of falsehood, the start of the liberation process from years of pretense and self-deception. For the first time in a very long time, he stopped running from himself, stopped seeking solace in external distractions. At this point of no return, when the pain reached its peak, he suddenly realized with crystal clarity that he could no longer, had no right to continue living as before. His old methods, his old survival strategies had lost all meaning. They no longer worked. To continue clinging to familiar patterns would mean to finally lose himself, to drown in an abyss of self-denial. This realization was not merely a thought, but a deep, piercing experience that shook him to his very core, forcing him to reevaluate all his priorities. This was a moment of truth when the choice became obvious. Either allow this pain to utterly destroy him, or use it as a catalyst for the deepest transformation. He stood on the threshold of the unknown, a door to a new dimension of being opened before him. But to enter it, he had to let go of everything that seemed important to him, everything that constituted his former self. This was a painful, but absolutely necessary step. He understood that the path ahead would be fraught with incredible difficulties, with pain and fear. But there was no choice. The only way to true healing and authenticity lay through fully embracing this breaking point and resolving to see it through to the end. After familiar landmarks crumbled and illusory stability dissolved, an unexpected and frightening truth unfolded before him. The path to true healing and self-discovery did not lead upward, to new heights of external achievements, or to even more perfect masks. On the contrary, it led relentlessly downward into the darkest and most unexplored depths of his own soul, to where shadows, fears, and forgotten parts of his being resided. This descent was not merely a metaphor, but a palpable reality, demanding courage and a willingness to confront what he had so long avoided. He understood that this inner darkness, which he considered an enemy, the source of all his troubles and anxieties, was in fact not an obstacle, but a portal. a gateway to profound transformation and rebirth. Every step in this journey inward was fraught with incredible resistance and deep-seated fear. He went where it was incredibly frightening, where reason lost its usual supports and logic proved powerless. It was a plunge into chaos, into a world where uncontrolled emotions, unhealed traumas, and old resentments reigned. But despite all internal barriers, despite the voice of the ego desperately clinging to old habits and perceived security, he continued his descent. He did this not out of recklessness or despair, but from a deep, intuitive understanding. There simply was no other path that could lead him to wholeness and authenticity. As he plunged deeper, the layers of his usual self gradually peeled away, revealing something more fundamental and true. Through pain and resistance, he began to discern the contours of his true self, who he truly was, without imposed roles and others' expectations. This was a process of deconstruction, the destruction of everything that was false and superficial, to make way for the authentic and profound. Every shadow he encountered, every fear he allowed himself to feel, became not an obstacle, but a step leading to deeper awareness. He discovered that this inner darkness, which seemed like a terrifying abyss, was in fact filled not with destructive power, but with potential for healing and growth. Within its depths lay not only his darkest secrets, but also his forgotten resources, his primordial strength, his intuition, and wisdom, which had been buried under years of suppression. This was a descent not into hell, but rather into an alchemical retort, where the old died so that the new could be born. He understood that only by going through this process could he achieve true freedom and return to himself, to his authentic, integral nature, which awaited him in the most hidden corners of his own being. As the internal descent grew deeper and more intense, he began to understand a fundamental, at times cruel, truth. The soul, in its relentless and all-encompassing thirst for truth, does not seek ease, fleeting comfort, or superficial well-being. It strives for the very essence of being, for unadulterated truth, no matter how harsh or painful it may be. And this truth, like a sharp blade, is capable of tearing apart, exposing the most sensitive nerves, even if consciousness is not yet ready for such radical surgical intervention into the accustomed fabric of his existence. The pain he had so long avoided and demonized now appeared before him in a completely different light, not as a curse or punishment, but as a sacred ritual, an indispensable part of the process of deep spiritual awakening. Every crisis, every loss, every encounter with his own shadow, all of this turned out to be not just a random confluence of circumstances, but a powerful, purifying fire. In this flame, akin to an alchemical process, the illusions he had so carefully cherished, the false beliefs that had served as his support for many years, the socially imposed roles that had constrained his true self, burned away. It was a fire that did not destroy but transformed, separating the wheat from the chaff, the authentic from the superficial. He felt everything that did not serve his highest good burning away, leaving behind only the pure, undistorted essence of his soul. By accepting this pain, by allowing it to pass through him, he discovered new, hitherto unexplored resources within himself. This was a paradoxical discovery. The deeper he plunged into the epicenter of his internal storm, the more light and clarity appeared on the horizon of his consciousness. Each new turn of suffering, it seemed, should have exhausted him, but instead, it filled him with a strange, unbearable, yet life-giving energy. It was the energy of transformation, a force capable of turning poison into medicine, destruction into creation. He realized that avoiding pain was not a path to happiness, but merely a postponement of the inevitable, an extension of his stay in illusion. True freedom and profound understanding came only through the complete acceptance of the entire spectrum of human experience, including its darkest and most unpleasant aspects. Now he saw pain not as an enemy, but as a guide, a teacher who pointed him to those corners of his soul where unresolved conflicts still lurked, where fears still lived, demanding healing. It was an agonizing, yet simultaneously deeply sacred journey, where every tear, every tremor became part of the great ritual of rebirth, purifying him for a new, more conscious life. After the ritual of pain cleansed him of numerous illusions, he, having descended into the most hidden corners of his inner universe, found himself face to face with long-banished parts of himself that until this moment had existed only in the depths of his subconscious. These were not abstract concepts, but living, pulsating energies, suppressed anger, accumulated over years under the weight of social expectations, crippling fear, which prevented him from moving forward, and the most intimate desires, which had been cast aside as unacceptable or shameful. The encounter with them was not merely metaphorical. It felt almost physical, like touching long-forgotten but still raw wounds. He expected to see monsters that would pounce on him, tear him apart. But instead, he discovered something entirely different. These parts, which he had so long perceived as enemies, as something alien and dangerous, now appeared before him in a new light. They were not destroyers, but his forgotten allies, his loyal companions who were simply waiting for him to dare to look them in the eye, acknowledge their existence, and accept them into his wholeness. The anger he had so carefully suppressed turned out not to be a destructive force, but a source of powerful energy for asserting his boundaries and defending his true values. Fear, which seemed paralyzing, in fact carried the wisdom of caution and a deep understanding of vulnerability. And desires, rejected as sinful, were keys to his authentic passion, to his life force, to his creative potential. For the first time, he saw his shadow not as a source of darkness, but as a repository of unused potential, like the dark side of the moon that always exists, even if it cannot be seen. It turned out to be not an obstacle, but a map of his wholeness, a detailed plan showing which parts of his soul had been rejected, where ruptures occurred, and where healing was needed. Only the shadow, with all its unconscious aspects, knew the way back to the fullness of being, to that primordial state of unity that had been lost in the process of adapting to the external world. Every dialogue with this shadowy part, every attempt to understand its true nature, was a step towards deep reconciliation with himself. He learned not to suppress, but to integrate, not to fight, but to accept. This process was agonizing, yet at the same time, incredibly liberating. He realized that true strength is born not from denying darkness, but from accepting and transforming it. It was in this encounter, in this act of deep internal alchemy, that he began to piece together his true, whole self, realizing that every banished part, every discarded aspect, carried a unique gift necessary for his genuine awakening. When the struggle with inner darkness reached its logical conclusion, when the ego, which had long dictated the terms of his existence, finally fell silent, yielding to a deep, all-encompassing quietude, something truly monumental occurred. This was not merely a pause between thoughts or external events, but a profound internal state of peace in which something true was born, something authentic and undistorted by external influences. In this sacred silence, where the noise of former ambitions, fears, and the endless pursuit of external approval dissolved, he realized that he no longer needed masks, no longer required elaborate facades to conceal his true self. Authenticity became his new, natural nature. Suddenly, the understanding dawned that true purpose was not something to be sought externally, achieved through an exhausting struggle for recognition, or built on the shaky foundation of external accomplishments. It was born not from successes, not from the applause of the crowd, not from material abundance, but from something far deeper and more fundamental, from survival in the depths of inner hell, from an honest and courageous confrontation with his own darkness. This was a purpose forged in the crucible of pain, purified by the fire of transformation, emerging from the ability not to break under the onslaught of inner demons, but to accept them, integrate them, and turn them into a source of strength. Every step taken into the depths of his soul, every accepted fear, and every integrated shadow became building blocks of his new reality. He no longer needed external approval because he had found an internal compass guiding him on his true path. Wholeness, attained through the acceptance of all his parts, became his unshakable foundation. In this silence, he heard the whisper of his soul, which had previously been drowned out by the cacophony of the external world. This whisper was clearer than any voice, for it carried the wisdom of ages and the knowledge of his true place in this world. The rebirth was complete. He had become different, but this different was not new, but rather reclaimed, restored. He returned to his primordial essence, to who he had always been, but whom he had lost under layers of social conditioning. His wounds, once seeming like sources of weakness and pain, now transformed into portals of light, into testaments of his courage and resilience. It was in these scars that his true strength resided, for they reminded him of the journey he had undertaken, and that even from the deepest darkness, one can emerge transformed. When the last echoes of former illusions dissolved into the silent depths of his awakened consciousness, he finally stopped running, not from someone external, but from himself, from the truth that had so long knocked from within. This was not merely a cessation of movement, but a profound, all-encompassing acceptance of his path, with all its twists and turns. He realized that the true meaning of his existence, that elusive essence he had desperately sought in external achievements and others' approval, was not hidden in who he appeared to be to others, in that meticulously constructed mask he had worn for so long. On the contrary, this meaning had always resided within, in who he always was, in his pristine, undistorted nature, before the world imposed its imprints and expectations upon him. This was a revelation that shook him to his core. All aspirations, all the race for external perfection, were merely a distraction from the main thing, from the internal source of strength and wisdom that had always been accessible. His wounds, those very painful points he had traversed, those very cracks that had formed in his soul under the pressure of suffering, now ceased to be symbols of weakness or deficiency. They transformed, becoming radiant sources of light and strength. Every mark on his soul, every scar became a testament to his courage, his ability to pass through darkness and emerge from it stronger, more conscious. He no longer feared his vulnerability, for he understood that his true power lay precisely within it. Tears he once hid now became rivers of purification, and pain that once paralyzed transformed into fuel for further growth. His body, this temple of the soul, began to be perceived as a sacred vessel that carried not only the experience of past sufferings, but also the potential for boundless joy and creativity. He felt the energy, once blocked in suppressed emotions, now flowing freely through his veins, filling him with vitality, as if a divine spark had rekindled in his heart. Thus, he found true freedom, freedom not from circumstances, but from internal bonds, from the need to conform, from the fear of being rejected. This freedom was not in external manifestations, but in a deep internal state, in the feeling of his wholeness and authenticity. He no longer needed an endless search, for he had found everything he sought within himself. And this discovered truth became his guiding star, illuminating the path for all who are ready to embark on this great journey to their own undistorted essence. His story concluded, but his journey continued, now filled with profound meaning and true light.